Okay. Okay, so recording is kicked off. Yeah, so welcome everyone to the first SIG testing group. We're kind of in the middle of hosting the final first groups meetings. Testing is one of them, and then we're also kind of getting ready to do repeat meetings. The testing group is interesting in that it's similar to the documentation group in that it kind of will touch most or all of the other groups in some shape or form. Essentially anything that's testing related, not only for the core server and API gateway and that kind of the core components, but anything testing related should be kind of discussed and shared and worked through in this group. Where we're kind of starting, we'll kind of go through, a little bit of continued intro. Everyone can kind of maybe just talk about who you are. And it could just be, hey, I'm Sally and I'm interested in testing, or it could be particularly what org and interests you have in testing, or maybe it's going to be your job and you'll be working on it. We'll kind of talk about the current state of testing, talk about some evaluations that we've already been doing, to pick some particular frameworks to start with. An important topic, which we'll partially cover today, and we'll go into more detail when we get to it, is coming up with standards is a little bit strong, but coming up with some level of testing standards that we want to do for what we want to deem supported SDKs. I put quotes around it purposefully, as supported will be kind of a loose term, but we'll have a certain intention that we'll want to target. Kind of testing futures, things that we won't really go into detail today, and the group probably won't really be deciding even in the next couple of weeks, but things that we want everyone to kind of be thinking of as they're working on their respective areas. And then of course discussion, Q&A. Just like before, if you haven't been on any of the other group meetings, feel free to just post questions or chime in while it's going on if you have questions. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right in. So in the current state of testing, the core devs have always been focused intently, just because of the intricacies of it, unit testing at the kind of server and kind of protocol level. So that would be kind of the peer servers and the core API server, which is just running a variant of the peer server. And where we've had less effort is on all the peripheral stuff and the end-to-end testing. So historically, if we're quickly approaching a year of beta since the first Catapult drop. So we did the first drop at the very end of March last year, and that was when we launched the first testnet on the kind of first beta release. We then subsequently did the second release and open sourcing of it in last May, and then it's been going through subsequent releases since then. So the early testing that was kind of external / end-to-end was really around the JavaScript SDK, which was and still kind of is the leading kind of front runner from an SDK development perspective. And just go into a little bit more detail, switch over. The SDK was split into kind of two projects. One of them dubbed the Nem library, the other one dubbed the SDK. And the SDK essentially wrapped and leveraged the library. Part of it was for separation of concerns, part of it was for increased usability and testing. So if you're curious, you can kind of go into the Nem2 library repo, and there's an end-to-end E2E kind of folder, and you can kind of see some of the original tests. So if we just kind of click into, let's go to one of hash lock transaction. So the original developer had basically kind of implemented, and then other people kind of participated, and it was used in the true form of testing, but also just like a very good validation as the early SDK development was going on. And then things kind of stayed like this for quite a while. Again, mostly to kind of help out with the first releases. Let me just click back over, get back to this. So again, if you're interested, let me paste this into the window. Then some subsequent efforts to kind of actually led, think of it as kind of like test-driven, development, or even like doc-driven development, was to essentially describe like a wider range of testing scenarios. And so a separate repo was created and then migrated not too long ago under the Nemtech umbrella. And it's called the nemtoscenarios. And if you just take some of the early ideas and functionality that was in the library testing, it was kind of to lay out a little bit more verbose test coverage and scenarios that were defined. And so if you click under the features, you'll get a list of subfolders, and let's just click into one of them. So creating a multi-signature contract feature, right? So if we click into that, it basically describes in kind of English form. We'll talk a little bit more about this later as we get into some of the evaluations. About creating a contract as user Alice. I want to create a multi-signature contract between my phone and my computer, so that I have multi-factor authentication. So this is just kind of a style of like behavioral driven kind of definitions of these testing scenarios. And again, it's kind of self-documenting from a testing perspective, and then obviously lays the groundwork for a certain level of coverage. The goal is to always have as wide a range of coverage without being like kind of over the top and super granular. But you want, the goal is to always have as good a testing as possible and always be increasing the coverage as best as resources allow. So you could kind of consider this to be the reboot of the early testing in the library, but in more of a focused, isolated manner. And some of that reasoning is to just kind of expand the scope and the focus of testing and kind of get it up to the next level as more stuff comes into the project. And the next thing, which I kind of referenced in the agenda, is that there's going to be this kind of, so ongoing, we've been working to get the library, the JavaScript library upgraded for the newest release, dubbed Cow, and get the latest features in there. And then in parallel, what's happening is this kind of, think of it as like a migration and a deprecation away from the library/SDK separation that exists today. So while it's a little bit too extreme to say that it's a rewrite, it's basically a re-architecting of the SDK. And there's several factors of it. One of the leading ones of which is the library was originally added to do a bunch of kind of data serialization work, as well as make testing a little bit more direct and straightforward, with some of the data serialization to essentially the goals, all of it to be externalized into a centralized library dubbed cat buffers. It made sense to also revisit testing and kind of, again, not so much redo it, but learn from what we did and kind of grow and extend it. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of a background, as well as stuff that's kind of happening, in the moment right now. So we're, let's say a day or two away from a Cal-based release, and then besides ongoing bug fixes and support of it, the group will kind of scoot along to start the rewrite migration as we ramp up the new test development efforts. So really what we have in like the current state, transitioning from where we're at to what we've been putting together in the new scenarios, Really looking and saying like, okay, we've always had like, decent to good to, coverage at kind of the lower kind of unit level. But really get to this end-to-end testing so things aren't as brittle. We can have a higher degree of support, kind of ramp up our continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines. So it's really this focus on the end-to-end, looking at things like at the API layer through the SDKs. And then there is going to be a specific effort as well that will be, it's related, but also some direct to the server tests, implementations for the scenarios, and some other testing to basically talk directly to the server, the protocol using the cat buffer implementation. So these things are kind of going to be all happening in parallel, but essentially think of it as kind of this just transition that the project's going through. And again, some of you, depending on what parts you're working on, you will do an implementation of it. We'll, again, talk in a little bit more detail. And some of that will come from this test spec repo, which I already kind of started going through. But, think of this, as David kind of spearheading the documentation effort for everything, and then kind of, picking this up as well and getting it organized and expanding the scope of it. So think of this as kind of like our, self-documenting roadmap that we're going to be targeting for everything. So let me pause there. I guess any questions?
Okay, so one doubt I have is like, are we going to implement for each layer the tests, or actually are we going to only do directly calling the API, or will be like using the SDKs, or what's the approach?
Yeah, it should be
here.
Yeah, essentially it'll kind of be all of that. So I think actually we'll cover that in a little bit more detail, specifically around the SDKs, because it'll probably be kind of like think of it as kind of like a gating effect. Like we're going to try to do a bunch of stuff in parallel, but given the energy that is going into the SDKs now and will be kind of ramping in the next few weeks, and some of the stuff Wayne's been putting together. So actually this is a good segue, and then we'll get into what do you call it? The support of the SDKs, which is like a big topic. So let me, so 1 second here, let me stop sharing. And Wayne, if you can kind of like run through real quick and share your screen.
Okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep, showing up on my end.
Yep.
Okay. So, let's introduce myself. I guess we didn't really go through an intro. Bill, and my focus is actually see if we can bring up like some kind of test environment where we actually have some CIs running maybe once a week, once a month, once whenever somebody checked in something, so we can get a little bit more reliable release and catch issues before we actually release stuff. So with that said, I've been going over a lot of test framework the first couple of weeks I've been here. The goal is to find one that's actually able to, one, do CI, plus able to support most of the languages that we have in our environment today. So like all of our SDKs and integration tests. So as SDKs, we have a whole bunch like C#, Java, JavaScript. And we want to find a framework that will actually cover all these languages, plus is resilient enough so that we can actually expand in the future. So after I tested a whole bunch, we kind of focused mainly on Gauge, Kumar, Karate, um, just from a REST testing framework. Karate is interesting in that you can actually do testing directly with the REST endpoint without even needing SDKs. So that would be useful if we weren't considering end-to-end test cases with the SDKs. But seeing that it's actually good to actually do actually true end-to-end tests, we decided to actually focus more on Gauge and Cucumber. Now, Cucumber is well known. Let me go to the pros and cons. All right, let's start with Gauge. Gauge is actually pretty new test framework. One of the things which I like about Gauge is it actually feels like a real integrated test environment. They have plugins for both Visual Studio Code and IntelliJ, and the plugins are pretty well integrated. So you can actually run test cases from the editor, and you can actually debug. Even though I did have some issues with debug. Gauge supports a good amount of language, being that its first release was just a month ago. And it makes it super easy to just actually set up your environment and actually get stuff going. You just do a Gauge int and it actually, and the language that you want, and it actually creates like a project, a blank project for you to actually go start do your work. Both of these, Gauge and Cucumber, they both use some type of DLCell, which is domain-specific language, to write your test casing. Cucumber actually uses jargons, and Gauge actually has its own markdown language where it basically does HTML without all the attributes inside here. So Gauge is a little bit more free flow in the sense that you can actually write anything as a step, and you can actually match that with a method, as opposed to Kumar is a little bit more restricted with the when and then scenarios. One of the issues which I had with Gauge was the test framework is new. Like I hit a couple bugs when I was initially testing, which like one of my test cases would fail in Cucumber, but not fail in Gauge, even though I'm assuming the exception is being thrown, just that it wasn't getting caught somewhere. Another thing was Gauge plugin for like Visual Studio Code wasn't working correctly. But Gauge actually supported a good amount of languages up to that, which was a good thing. Kumar is pretty well known, and it was a large support community. It was actually easy to go search and find help on, like all the websites. So there are people who have problems with Cucumber and they have some kind of workaround that you could use to move forward. So that was one of the positive for me from Cucumber. Java support Cucumber is real good. I think Java is probably the main language they support. They support like JavaScript, C++, and others, but I think Java is the one that's being maintained the most. And one of the other big factor for Cucumber is it's pretty extendable. So it has a lot of third-party support. Like you can use other testing tools with Cucumber, like Karate, Mercosur. So even if you want to later change our test strategy and include like direct endpoint testing, we can also include that at a later point. The cons, there weren't much, and like this is just my preferences that from a Kumar point of view, each language was a separate package. So it wasn't like you install one thing and then you add extension to it. It's like you have independent installations for Kumar, which is fine. It's just a little bit more overhead to get set up. And one of the things that Gauge actually had built-in data passing. So if you want to pass data from one step or even from one scenario to the next, everything is actually built into Gauge, as opposed to Cucumber, you actually have to create your own class to actually pass data between steps or scenarios. The good thing is that it gives you a little bit more flexibility with stuff you can do. So with all that said, going forward, we're picking Cucumber as the test tool that we are going to be using. And this ties into all the work that David have done already with writing all these mem scenarios that we have out there. So it would be a perfect fit, and we don't have to actually reinvent the wheel for anything else. I think that's it for me.
Okay.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah, any questions regarding the frameworks?
Or if anybody have any other suggestions that they want us to revisit?
Well, I have a concern with Cucumber or with BDD that, for example, if you force a bad type in the SDK, imagine, for example, if I send an alias, well, no, an alias transaction is not a good example, a multi-sig account, and instead of add or delete a cosignatory, I just put a 7, that it's not anything. So add it's 0 and remove it's 1, I think. So this with BDD scenarios is difficult to express because you don't want to refer too much to the implementation.
Right.
So with Cucumber, I didn't find a way to test these end-to-end scenarios. And I didn't know about Gauge before this conversation, but it's interesting that it allows you more like freedom in order to define your own scenarios. Like,
yeah, that's one thing which I like about Gauge was that it gives you a little more freedom. You're not tied to the when then scenario. You actually can express a test case naturally and then go write it. So.
Yeah, I mean, I like BDD for things that can be described, but there are like some other things that should be also tested. And I don't think that BDD scenarios are enough for these edge cases or when you are like fusing a little bit with data. So it's something that we should like think a little bit more in order to choose the framework. If it supports this kind of testing, we have two approaches: or create a separate project to test these specific cases, or just to force the syntax in order to accomplish these tests that are difficult to describe.
Yeah, and that was one of the thoughts which I had, but the question is, how many times are we going to hit these edge scenarios? And Gauge is new, which, I mean, I'm pretty sure we're going to hit bugs with it. So it's a catch-22. I mean, but I understand your point.
I think I saw another question. So Jeff asks, does it matter which one to use for Python or PHP? I assume you're referring, Jeff, to Python or PHP SDKs, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So, like, Cucumber has all these supports right here. So, let's see. It has PHP. I think this one.
Yeah, it's got
Python is right here.
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it has a lot of support as opposed to Gauge. Oops. So Gauge basically is extendable by plugins. So you install the product once, but everything else is just a plugin that you install as an afterthought. So Gauge has Python, Golang, JavaScript, Ruby, C# and Java.
Hmm.
And I'm pretty sure they're going to keep expanding on the language support, as you know.
So do I maybe have this correct that we're going to have some SDKs with Gauge and some with Cucumber, or we're going to try to do both with some of them, or it's the discretion of whoever's building it? It's kind of like pick one and go, or
yeah. The goal is to at least come up with some base. Actually, this is a good segue. Why don't we just transition into?
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, let's just transition in because this covers. Let me go. Oh, I forgot. Oh, my slide got. So 1 second here. Let me. Sorry, guys. 1 second. One of my slides got chopped off.
no worries, no worries.
Okay, so I just inserted a slide 7. One of the items got deleted. So let me share again. Let me know if it's showing up on your guys' end. So to your question, Jeff, and actually this is related a little bit to some of what you asked David as well. This is definitely not, the goal is not to say like, hey, this is the be all end all of testing. We definitely want to cast this net of like end-to-end testing and then looking at a set of priorities, right? If we could snap our fingers and time and human resources were not an issue. When we wake up tomorrow, of course, we'd have all types of testing for everything, right? But if we kind of pick and choose where we're at today and where the next few weeks and next couple of months are going to come. So like the first things coming down the pipeline, obviously, are updates to the current SDK and then upgrades to the Java and then implementations of new SDKs, whether it's Python or other, which seems to be one of the leading candidates. So with that, we want to talk about, standards for, supported SDKs using air quotes there. So like a good reference is actually what we just talked about with Cucumber, where Wei-Yin was screen sharing, and you notice they had a couple different delineations. One of it was kind of like officially supported, semi-supported, and then essentially unmaintained. I think there was a tag on the secondary Python one, right, where the primary one was like semi-supported. And so essentially we're going to have a similar type distinction for not just SDKs, but kind of for everything, but SDKs will kind of be the first one. So from an SDK perspective, currently our mindset is, our goal, at least to start with, kind of walk before we run or crawl before we walk, is let's try to get to a point to where we say that the JavaScript SDK is the first really supported one. And we want to set a certain kind of standard for what that means. So a few weeks ago, we kind of had some light discussions on, and we'll cover it more in subsequent meetings, but of using documentation as a set of standardization to set a quality level for things that are going to be released, such as SDKs or general API features. Testing is yet another one of those lines we kind of want to target and set. We don't want to be like over the top strict, but at the same time, we want to have somewhat of a high barrier. So a way that we can kind of approach it, at least our current thinking, is if we're leveraging a tool like Cucumber and we have this base set of scenarios that we can say, hey, support 100% of these scenarios. And if your build tag is green, success, then it's deemed supported as long as your stuff's documented, right? So if you're documented and your tests are passing green with a certain success rate, that's a certain level of success that we can kind of say, okay, you are quote unquote supported. Now, whether that's fully supported or semi-supported, we'll figure that out as we go. So really, like, docs and testing are kind of what we view as the initial linchpins for general quality control, and then setting some benchmarks. So if someone new shows up and they're like, I want to do a Ruby SDK, great. Here's the roadmap. Here's what you have to do. Here's some examples. Here's how you kind of tackle implementing it. Here's examples of documentation. Here's the test scenarios that you'll have to tackle. Ask questions, go from there. So we're thinking, whether it's 100% coverage or 80% or partial or whatever, it's kind of, hey, if it's documented, then it should be supported and it should have a test that pass. If you're implementing an undocumented feature or some future thing that's maybe will be documented over subsequent weeks or months, maybe you don't need a test, and maybe it doesn't need to pass, and it could be like buyer beware. But this was again a specific topic I wanted to bring up. I mean, we're not like setting these standards today or tomorrow, but conversationally, it's like, again, we kind of started the conversation around docs as kind of a gating factor for general releases for the server and the API. And how does that segue into using testing as another kind of gating factor to general quality control? So I guess to zoom in on your question, Jeff, like the goal would be for the first crop of SDKs is to have these conversations and come up with some agreement on like, hey, these base test scenarios, while not exhaustive and perfect, this is something that gives us a good enough feeling that if you have a test suite for your SDK that can like pass these scenarios, that you're at a good enough level where we can like say, hey, if the build's passing and your stuff's documented, people can use it with a certain level of confidence against whatever version it's supposed to be supporting, right? And as new versions come out or things update, obviously there's breakage, right? It's standard software development lifecycle stuff that we'll have to deal with, but this is the initial goal. So I guess I'll pause there. Any questions about the general idea of kind of using testing and scenarios, implementation and coverage as some gating factor to enforce a certain approach and quality across a range of SDKs. Any questions or comments?
I guess I'll jump in with one more. Do you have any ideas on what your preference would be if people are writing tests as they go? Do we,
Not yet. So like a good example is with the, what's his name? With Shintat, he actually brought up a question around some guys on his team, some interns or something that were looking at some testing stuff. And that was like a good question. He just kind of raised it, wanted to get some input. And our feedback was kind of like, well, kind of similar to the SDK, people can start kind of ramping up. Pretty much what I suggested is like, well, I suggest you don't start writing tests today. I suggest you start ramping up on general knowledge of how things work for these intern guys. In the meantime, I was like, hey, we're going to be holding our first testing meeting, kind of completing this first pass on evaluation of frameworks. That's not to say that someone can't just be like, hey, I've used this framework, this other tool for years, or maybe just new, and I really like it, and this is what I'm going to use. I'm going to move forward and use this. Of course, people can do that, and they can like re-implement, scenarios and coverage. That's of course fine. The goal, though, is hopefully to say like, hey, we have a certain level. I mean, in the crypto blockchain space, a certain level of consensus amongst people that are actively working on testing. Certain consensus to say like, yes, this makes sense as a starting point, right? This isn't going to be the be all end all. but it's a starting point to push forward for a certain level of coverage and a certain approach. So currently where we're at, I mean, let's not say that it's 100% decided, but we are decently decided after a range of research and prototyping that Gherkin as a definition language for BDD and Cucumber as a tool that supports at least the initial wide range of languages that we're even looking at, combined with the test scenarios we already have, is a very good potential starting point. That's why it's, you know, we kind of covered, these are kind of the main topics today in this initial meeting. Then from here, the goal would be obviously anyone who's on here, or anyone who watches or asks questions after the facts or reads the notes, is we don't want this, just like other scenarios with the SDK, the APIs, the wallets, clients, we don't want this topic to linger too long because we want to kind of scoot along. But we do want people to give feedback, whether you want to give it right now in the moment or think about it, or someone that wasn't able to hop on the meeting today reviews it after the fact. But that's our current mindset, is that like, hey, this seems like an initial starting point to tackle at least a wide range of these initial test problems and approaches at the SDK and end-to-end level. We can get feedback while moving forward, adjust where we need to, and then as we kind of hit gaps, start to maybe implement different testing, maybe to touch other areas, or you know, whether that's leveraging a different framework or, you know, a separate testing project. So it's kind of like cross those bridges when we get there, but let's start with this and start to get everyone's feedback. So yeah.
I would say, just from my point, is that I wouldn't prevent someone from writing code without tests. It's just that by the time we come to release time, tests needs to be there to say, you know, especially for new features and, you know, stuff that they're writing to make sure that they work correctly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a perfect point, right? We don't like, this isn't like, if you're writing tests, you have to do this, you have to use this framework, you have to use these scenarios. But the goal is to kind of, again, consensus around a certain approach. Now, if someone writes a completely different framework and they have great coverage, and you know, necessary people do a review and look at the CI pipeline and see that it's passing, I don't doubt that there's going to be a scenario where, whether it's a tool, actually this is like a perfect segue, I'll just go into futures, right? So today we're primarily talking about like a base level of starting point for end-to-end testing, specifically around the SDKs and APIs. But obviously there's a whole nother level of, you know, wallets and clients coming, and Block Explorer and whatever, right? Block Explorers potentially. And these all themselves have their own testing, both at the unit level as well as the functional level. So especially at the unit level, whatever people are writing, like, definitely just implement what you're going to implement, what you're most comfortable with. We just want to kind of up level and say, hey, from a group approach, for instance, it's much, if we can come to a certain level of agreement, it's really great to say, this is the documented standards for test coverage for SDK and API support. And if you can support this, then this is what we deem good. And, you know, and like, I don't doubt that someone's going to be like, oh, well, I came up with these other 6 scenarios, and maybe we lump them into the core test suite. Or maybe we say, well, those are good, but those are more nice to haves for edge cases. Let's put those as a secondary test suite or something, right? And again, I see these things kind of organically evolving where we want to move forward, but not prevent anyone from doing what's comfortable and efficient for them, right? So if people are comfortable using other frameworks and they don't have the interest at all in in kind of what we're trying to get consensus on, that's still fine, as long as, again, we get a certain level of quality. And it might even be, it doesn't have to be quality, right? Like, this project is not unique in the world. We're not reinventing the wheel. So if you look at pretty much any project that has SDKs and like APIs, there's always going to be some level of quote unquote supported and quote unquote unsupported or community supported SDKs. So it might be that someone builds an SDK that hasn't been in any of these meetings and doesn't read the core docs and doesn't hang out on Slack, but they just kind of start hacking away. Well, that's fine. That can be a community SDK for some period of time, whether it's forever or for a month or for a release or two, and then it migrates or not over time to kind of come into the fold if it makes sense. So that's kind of the mindset. Try to provide some base level and roadmap for everyone to follow and work off of, so it's common. but not restricted to that level where it's a choke point. I guess any other questions around that? I kind of segued since we were relative to like, yeah, we're not really covering it today, but testing futures and things that are to be determined, right? So, you know, wallets, clients, anything else, will have their own kind of testing focus, but we'll want to reflect on those within, you know, the testing group, whether or not people from the testing group are directly involved in implementing it, right? So a good example, Jeff, is, you know, you asked the question of, should these, you know, couple initial wallets talk to the APIs directly or leverage the SDKs? And the idea is like, well, probably makes most sense for maintainability and support and quality control to leverage the SDK. That way, in theory, you can enforce a certain level of quality on the SDK, then test the wallet maybe at a different level, whether that's UI testing or other. So like these things are relatively intertwined, but again, we're not going to get too deep into those right now. We're kind of starting at a base level of API, SDK, you know, people look and think through these frameworks and scenarios. And then in the meantime, though, we're going to be kind of prototyping and moving forward. So the level we've gotten to so far is base scenarios, reflect on them, add, update, start looking at Cucumber, more prototyping after Wayne prototyped through the various frameworks and kind of got like a getting started experience and some initial tests to kind of evaluate. I know Shintat had mentioned that his intern guys were already doing, they were using Gherkin. They might have also been using Cucumber. I can't remember. I have to go back to the thread.
Yeah, Cucumber.
Yeah, and so again, I had mentioned, I was like, well, I'm not saying stop working, but maybe just have them like ramp up on just general concepts and documentation instead of writing a bunch of tests right now. And then maybe in a week or two, they can then start doing it with purpose if it makes sense to start building from those same scenarios. Because I know that team is working on the Java SDK, right? So a good example is, hey, instead of writing your own scenarios from scratch, we already have a base set to work off of. Whether you want to use all of them or some of them to start is up to you, but we're trying to, again, provide a common approach, hopefully. So again, we had some messaging exchanges. I think that was maybe last week. But yeah, that's the kind of the general state of things. We want definitely a range of feedback as people are starting to dig into various SDKs and other stuff. Again, in the meantime, kind of push forward. Wayne will continue on digging more into scenario stuff and also some cat buffer stuff and some other testing that needs to be done. And then some stuff we'll probably cover in subsequent meetings is, as this stuff advances, we'll probably talk about maybe some common approaches to common and or shared and community supported like CI pipelines and delivery pipelines. So just like with any software project, right, we want to do isolated testing for each component and then a level of end-to-end testing between certain components and then maybe another level of end-to-end testing across several. So we're doing some of that now in silos and also manually. So these are other things we want to learn about. So those are other things that are kind of starting to pop up as we're getting into more releases. So we're kind of learning as we go based on past just work experiences and stuff. So yeah, I guess I will stop share from there. And I guess we can break into any kind of like last questions or comments or whatever.
No extra comments for me.
Okay. Well, yeah, I guess that's, we actually used up a good chunk of the scheduled hour. I thought it would go quicker, but it's good, to have a base set of questions. So this is a good first kickoff for the testing group. So yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. I will have a couple things to take care of the rest of the afternoon, but some point today, I will get the recording kind of converted and uploaded just like we have with some of the other groups. We'll gather some of the notes and links to update. and post those. And from here, just let's continue the conversation on the Slack. And probably won't be next week, but maybe the week after, we might schedule, the next meeting as we kind of advance things and conversations happen. If it's required, we'll do it next week, but most likely it won't be, given there's some things to do. And we can go from there. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining.
Yes, thank you.